Alright, nostalgia bias. Officially is defined as a cognitive bias where people tend to recall the past more fondly than the present, often remembering things better than they actually were. When we talk about it in sports, we're usually referring to people who dick ride older players and refuse to give newer ones their props. A lot of people deny that a current player is on the level of older players simply because they're older. Most people don't even realize when they do this. It's mostly subconscious, but why does it happen? There's a few reasons, but the biggest reason is definitely selective memory. This is probably the biggest issue in the sport of football because it's probably the major sport that's least reliant on stats to determine how good a player was. For players like defenders and midfielders, you'd have to actually watch the players consistently to determine how good they were in your eyes. And even though it's possible to go back and watch plenty of full matches, most young people today aren't doing that. This leads to most of them relying on the word of older people to determine how good players were, which creates the idea that they're untouchable by modern players. No matter what a current player does, no matter how ridiculous they are or how obvious it is that they've evolved past anything an older player is capable of. Most people nowadays aren't actually sitting and watching every week of past seasons. Sure, they might watch a few full games, but what games are those? The big ones, the iconic ones, the ones where these players put up great performances. No one's watching match week 12 to 15 of the 2006 season where the matchups were like Sunderland, Villa, Charlton, and Wigan or whatever. They're watching the iconic match week 16 versus the great Chelsea and then skipping a couple months later to the memorable game against Arsenal. This creates the false idea that these players were 100% great all the time. Then you look at the modern players and see them having random off weeks or dry spells and think, well, they can't be the level of older players because older players were always great. In reality, that isn't exactly true. Yes, there were plenty of legends that were great the majority of the time, almost week in and week out, but some weren't, and even the consistent ones had their occasional moments. A lot of people are holding current players to a standard that doesn't exist. That's an example of selective memory, something that's pretty unfair to modern players who have every game under a microscope while older players mostly have their best games examined. Now, to be fair, recency bias is almost as much of a plague as nostalgia bias. There's plenty of reactionist takes about modern players that are very ridiculous and over the top. However, there's a lot more cases of nostalgia bias discrediting modern players and downplaying just how good they actually are. That's not to say that older players are only considered legends because they're older. Most of them actually deserve their status. It's just that sometimes people act like they're unreachable to modern players just because they're already legends. Most recently, there's been two players at the center of the nostalgia bias discussion. One of them is Virgil van Dijk. The other one we'll get to later. Van Dijk is the perfect modern defender, literally. There's no doubt that he had the highest peak of any center back in Premier League history back in 2019, at least in my opinion. After that unreal year where he almost won the Ballon d'Or, there were people already calling him the best Prem center back ever, and when you really look at it, he had an argument from an individual point of view. If we're talking about pure talent, versatility, and skill, you could very easily make a case for Van Dijk being the best ever in the Prem. Speed, strength, a very high IQ, his tackling, on the ball, everything. It's literally damn near impossible to find a defender in the history of any league that you could even argue was that perfect and complete as an overall player. There's two things people use to discredit Van Dijk though. The first is his trophy cabinet. While I do believe that trophies are very important when we're talking about greatest players ever, they're low-key irrelevant when we're talking about best players individually. Context also matters when we're talking about trophy cabinets too. Out of the 7 seasons with the most points in Prem history, Liverpool has 3 of them, and Van Dijk has led Liverpool in all 3, yet has 1 Prem trophy to show for it because of that bald hellspawn over in Manchester. The second thing people use to discredit Van Dijk is longevity, which I guess is a very valid argument. Unfortunately, it's also very inaccurate sometimes when we talk about Van Dijk because people act like he had 2 great seasons then dipped off somewhere. I don't know why people always pretend players' careers only started after they moved to huge teams. Van Dijk's first season in the Prem, 2015, he was already regarded as one of the best center backs in the league. He had some of the best clubs in the world willing to pay over £50 million for him around 2016 at a time that price wasn't even a thought for pretty much any center back, and people think his career just started at Liverpool. Since 2015, he was elite and arguably world class, all the way up until that injury in the beginning of the 2020 season. He was alright the following season and kind of bad last season, I won't lie, but this year he's reclaimed his spot as best center back in the world, and any Ruben Diaz arguments at this point have gotten ridiculous. He's outperforming everybody again, and he's currently in his 5th season that I'd consider world class. He doesn't exactly match the longevity of names like John Terry or Rio Ferdinand, but he isn't a one-season wonder. When we're talking about best players ever, At what point does the utter ridiculousness of a player override longevity? Even being a solid player after tearing your ACL at almost 30 is crazy enough, but he's not only solid, he's returned to the top of his position. If we're talking about my personal opinion, I feel like having the best single season of any defender in the history of the sport and genuinely challenging Lionel Messi for a Ballon d'Or in one of his best seasons ever to go along with his 5 or so years as a top center back is enough to at least put him at the table with the best defenders ever. Longevity is important, but it isn't the end-all be-all. This is where nostalgia bias comes into play. You wouldn't believe some of the names people pulled out of their ass when the question was raised of Van Dijk potentially being the best Prem defender ever. Look at this shit. There's at least 6 players here that shouldn't even be in the same stratosphere as Van Dijk. Let's be real. This one is even worse. Half these motherfuckers are laughable. I know y'all see that Ruben Diaz sneak too. He thought he was slick. Van Dijk is the best Premier League defender of the modern day, but he's not at the level of the best ever. It's a statement that we've seen from so many people, and the question is, why? There isn't a player as all-around elite as him. Like, ever. Out of all those Premier League legends that constantly get brought up, I don't believe there's one we can say is as complete as Van Dijk. He has the best peak as well. Mind you, Van Dijk has never played with a world-class center back. Like, ever. Konate is the closest he's ever gotten, and sure, it's debatable whether Konate is world-class, but compare Van Dijk's partners in his career to those of the legendary Prem defenders that people claim he isn't as good as. You hear Vidic's name, and Ferdinand isn't far behind. Terry had Carvalho. Van Dijk's partners look laughable in comparison. In my opinion, longevity isn't what prevents Van Dijk from being on their level. It's what prevents him from completely eclipsing them right now. I don't think he's the best defender in Premier League history, and I definitely don't think he's the best defender ever. I think he's already cemented a place in their tier of players, though, especially when we talk about them individually. I do have Terry and Ferdinand definitively above him, and this is where I think longevity comes into play. Sustaining his level for a few more years is what would definitively put him above them, at least for me. It's not even like that's an outrageous thing to say either. I mean, there's players that already think he's the #1 defender in Premier League history right now. Kompany said it a few years ago. Putting a few more trophies in his cabinet would definitely help out when it comes to his legend status, but even when it comes to modern players who've won a bunch of trophies, there's still disrespect. This is where we turn to Kevin De Bruyne. KDB has the skill, he has the trophies, he has the longevity to a certain extent. It's not really up for debate. Let's really get into it. I may hate this abandoned Weasley child with a passion, but I'm not about to sit up here and lie. The argument recently has become whether he deserves to sit at the table with Scholes, Lampard, and Gerrard as the greatest Prem midfielders of all time. In my opinion, if we're talking about greatness, then he can easily sit at that table. Put together skill, achievements, and trophies, and he's comfortable as shit over there. He's won Player of the Season twice, more than all 3 of them combined. He has 5 Premier League titles. He just got a UCL medal finally, and he's led both the Centurions and the treble winners to legendary status. When you look at that and then look at his talent as a player too, the ridiculous passing, unreal vision, and nonsensical IQ, he's one of the best game changers in the world right now. Just look at what he did like last month when he came back from injury. There really shouldn't be any question of if he deserves to sit at that table, and it's absurd to not put him in the conversation with the big 3. Once again, this is where the only real explanation becomes nostalgia bias. On both an individual level and an overall greatness level, there's no reason for KDB to not be up there. Even if you try to use the longevity argument, you're basically saying that KDB has achieved more in a shorter time span than the others besides Scholes, and that only adds to his case. Either way, KDB has been a world-class Prem midfielder since 2015. It's been almost a decade. At some point, you can't just throw the longevity argument at anybody that's still playing. That man old as hell, and you got people talking about some few more years. Bruh, he already 50 million years old. Anyways, what's the main point of this video? Honestly, it was more of a conversation starter. How much do we value longevity over the peak of a player? Specifically when it comes to Van Dijk, what more does he have to do, and how long do you think he has to do it for to be considered the #1 defender in the history of the Prem? It's a very subjective topic, which is why I feel like it's dumb to get heated at these kinds of conversations. There's no reason why someone else should have to value longevity over peak just because you do, and vice versa. For me personally, I think there should be some sort of balance, but normally I lean towards peak mattering more than longevity. If there's a player that's elite for 15 seasons but not really unbelievable in any of them, I'd take a player that's unbelievable for 5 seasons and just good for the rest of his career. Now, sometimes there's players that manage to have both absurd longevity and an absurd peak. Messi and Ronaldo are obvious examples. Often, though, it's one or the other, and a person's ranking of players usually shows which one they value more. I also hate the use of trophies when people argue about individual players and they act like trophies are the end-all be-all. When we're talking about a player being better than another player, trophies are never going to be a central argument. That shit only comes in when you're talking about legend status and greatest players ever, which is why we talked about it in the KDB conversation and not the Van Dijk one. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like current players get the short end of the stick and will continue to get the short end of the stick until they retire, and I don't see the problem with giving them their flowers right now. You can talk about longevity and trophies all you want, but at the end of the day, Van Dijk has already performed at a level unmatched by any defender in history. He had people desperately waiting for him just to get dribbled past for a whole year. There's times I wish he won that Ballon d'Or just so that year could be fully appreciated. As for the nostalgia bias conversation, as I'm making this video, KDB has 4 assists and Haaland has 5 goals in an hour against Luton. Some people will argue that KDB is a rich man's Gucci though. Yeah, alright. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, y'all. I'm gonna see y'all next time.